There was a time when the edges of the known world weren't marked by borders or coastlines. They were guarded by monsters. Picture a medieval map, its parchment yellowed with age, the ink fading into swirling seas and jagged mountains. But look closer and you'll spot them. Dragons coiled around uncharted islands, giants towering over distant shores, and creatures so strange they defy description. These weren't just decorations, they were warnings, wonders, and whispers of a world beyond human understanding. Today, we're stepping into that realm of mystery to uncover 30 of the most astonishing beasts ever drawn on the eastern edges of Christian maps, where geography blurred into legend and faith collided with the unknown. What made these creatures so compelling? Imagine living in an age when travel was perilous, when the farthest reaches of the Earth might as well have been another planet. To medieval minds, the unknown wasn't just empty space, it was a canvas for their deepest fears and wildest dreams. A dragon wasn't merely a beast, it was a symbol of chaos, a test of faith. A giant wasn't just tall, it embodied the untamed power of nature itself. These maps weren't just guides, they were stories, sermons, and sometimes even survival manuals. And the creatures, they were the protagonists of a drama playing out at the very edge of human knowledge. But here's the twist, many of these beasts weren't pure invention. Some were born from misunderstood travelers' tales, others from the distorted echoes of real animals described by explorers. A monstrous serpent might have been a crocodile, exaggerated over countless retellings. A headless man with eyes on his chest could have been a garbled account of tribal warriors. The line between fact and folklore was thin, and that's what makes these creatures so fascinating. They're not just relics of superstition, they're proof of how humans have always tried to make sense of the unfamiliar. So let's unravel these legends together, tracing their origins, their meanings, and the enduring power they held over the medieval imagination. By the time we're done, you'll never look at an old map the same way again. To truly grasp why these mythical creatures lurked at the edges of medieval maps, we have to step into the minds of the people who drew them. Think of a mappa mundi not as a tool to guide travelers, but as a visual sermon, a parchment where every stroke carried meaning. The known world sat at the center, often with Jerusalem as its heart, radiating outward like ripples in a pond. But as the eye traveled eastward, the ink grew bolder, wilder. This wasn't carelessness, it was intentional. The farther lands stretched from Christendom, the more they belonged to legend. The East held a unique place in the medieval imagination. It was the direction of sunrise, of rebirth, yet also the origin of invaders, plagues, and storms. It housed the Garden of Eden, but also the kingdoms of Gog and Magog, monstrous forces prophesied to bring about the end of days. No wonder cartographers populated these margins with hybrids and horrors. A dragon wasn't just decoration, it was a boundary marker, a spiritual keep-out sign. A cyclops or a cyapod, those one-legged shadow-footed creatures, weren't mere oddities. They were reminders beyond the familiar lay realms where God's order might not apply. Even the phrase, "Here be dragons," is more than a warning, it's an admission of humility. These maps acknowledged that some places were beyond human mastery, realms where faith had to replace facts, and that's why the beasts mattered. They weren't just filling blank space, they were holding a mirror to medieval Europe's deepest anxieties. What if the world was vaster than we dared to explore? What if the monsters were real? In an age without satellites or encyclopedias, the unknown wasn't just empty, it was alive. Among all the creatures that prowled the edges of medieval maps, none commanded respect quite like the griffin, part lion, part eagle, and entirely magnificent. This wasn't just another monster scribbled in the margins. It was a regal hybrid, a living emblem of power that straddled two worlds. The lion's body spoke of earthly strength, the undisputed king of beasts, while the eagle's head and wings reached skyward, a symbol of divine authority. Together, they created a creature that medieval Christians believed could guard the boundary between heaven and earth itself. Walk into any great cathedral from the Middle Ages, and you'll likely spot griffins carved into stone or gleaming in stained glass. They weren't just decoration. These images whispered a promise that the sacred was protected. Some stories claimed griffins stood watch over the treasures of Solomon or even the Holy Grail, their piercing eyes never blinking, their talons ever ready. But their role wasn't just spiritual, it was practical too. In an age where travel was perilous and the unknown lurked beyond every horizon, the griffin became a kind of cosmic border patrol. Its presence on a map signaled not just danger, but a sacred kind of awe. Venture here, it seemed to say, and you answer to a higher order. Then there were the nests. Oh, the nests, tales swirled that griffins built their homes from solid gold, high in the remote mountains of the east. Imagine how that sounded to a medieval listener, riches beyond measure, just waiting where the world faded into legend. It's no wonder these stories fueled expeditions and daydreams alike. The griffin wasn't merely a beast, it was a paradox. It represented both the untouchable majesty of the divine and the very human hunger for adventure and wealth. But perhaps the griffin's greatest power was its ability to embody contradiction. It was fierce yet noble, earthly yet celestial, a reminder that the world was far stranger and more wondrous than it seemed. In a time when faith and curiosity walked hand in hand, the griffin stood as the perfect guide, part guardian, part invitation to look beyond the known. And that's why it endured, not just as a myth, but as a mirror to the medieval mind's deepest yearnings. If the griffin was the noble guardian of medieval maps, the basilisk was their ultimate terror, a creature so deadly that even its shadow could wither plants and its breath crack stone. This wasn't just a snake, it was the Serpent King, crowned with a diabolical reputation. Picture a monster born from a rooster's egg, a grotesque contradiction that defied nature itself. How could a bird, symbol of dawn and resurrection, produce such a thing? Medieval scholars wrestled with this riddle, seeing in the basilisk a twisted reflection of divine order overturned. Its very existence was a blasphemy, a living omen of lands where God's grace seemed absent. The basilisk's power lay in its gaze. A single glance could stop a man's heart mid-beat. Maps marked its territory with trembling ink, warning travelers that here, even the air carried death. Some accounts claimed the creature's venom was so potent it seeped into the earth, poisoning wells and rivers for miles. No sword could pierce its hide, no shield could block its stare. The only hope, a weasel. Yes, this tiny, fierce predator was believed to be the basilisk's one natural enemy, a quirk that spoke volumes about medieval logic. If even the mightiest knight fell to the Serpent King, perhaps humility, not brute force, was the true weapon against evil. But where did such a legend begin? Look to the deserts of North Africa, where hooded cobras reared up like kings, their venom lethal enough to kill within hours. Now imagine a traveler, exhausted and delirious, stumbling upon such a sight. By the time the story reached Europe, the snake had grown horns, wings, or even a rooster's comb. The basilisk became a patchwork of fears, part reptile, part demon, all dread. Its presence on maps wasn't just about geography, it was a moral lesson. Venture too far from God's light, and you might find a world where creation itself had gone wrong. Yet the basilisk's legacy isn't just one of horror. It also reveals how medieval minds sought to explain the unexplainable. When a pilgrim returned with tales of a snake that spat fire or a bird that birthed monsters, scholars didn't dismiss them. They wove these fragments into a tapestry of meaning. The basilisk wasn't merely a warning. It was a puzzle, a challenge to faith and reason alike. In a world where the line between miracle and monstrosity was thin, even the deadliest creature held a mirror to human curiosity and the unshakable urge to chart the unknown, no matter how terrifying. The Blemie weren't just another oddity scribbled in the margins of medieval maps. They were a full-blown existential crisis. Imagine a creature with no head at all, its face planted squarely in the center of its chest, eyes peering out from above a mouth that never knew a chin. To European cartographers, these so-called headless men weren't merely monsters. They were walking question marks, living challenges to the very idea of what it meant to be human. The legend of the Blemie stretches back centuries, all the way to Pliny the Elder's natural history, where they were described as a tribe lurking in the deserts of Africa. But by the Middle Ages, they'd migrated eastward, becoming fixtures on maps of India and the mysterious edges of Asia. Their grotesque anatomy wasn't just for shock value, it served a purpose. In a world where the human form was seen as divinely ordained, a creature that defied it so boldly was a shudder-inducing reminder. Venture too far, and you might find realms where even the rules of creation bent. But here's the fascinating twist. The Blemie might not have been pure fantasy. Some historians suggest these nightmarish figures sprang from garbled accounts of real warriors. Picture a traveler stumbling upon a distant tribe whose fighters wore elaborate masks or helmets that obscured their heads, leaving only the impression of a face on the chest. Add the distortions of time, language barriers, and the medieval love for embellishment, and suddenly, a cultural practice becomes a race of anatomical anomalies. What's most revealing about the Blemie isn't their bizarre appearance, it's what they say about the medieval mind. They embodied the terror of the unfamiliar, the unsettling idea that humanity might not look the same everywhere. In an age where faith taught that man was made in God's image, creatures with faces on their chests weren't just odd, they were heresy made flesh. Yet, paradoxically, their presence on maps also hints at a grudging curiosity. Even as they repelled, they invited the bold to wonder, what else might lie beyond the edges of the known world? The Blemie's legacy lingers not because they were the scariest monsters on the map, but because they blurred the line between us and them. They forced medieval Europe to confront a haunting question. If humanity could wear so many faces, who's to say what's truly monstrous? Of all the creatures that haunted medieval maps, none provoked deeper theological dilemmas than the Cynocephali, those enigmatic dog-headed men who stood on the precarious edge between humanity and monstrosity. Saint Augustine himself wrestled with their existence in his writings, pondering whether these beings possessed rational souls. If God created man in his own image, what did it mean for a creature to wear the face of a beast yet walk upright, wield weapons, even as some accounts claimed worship Christ? This wasn't just curiosity, it was a crisis of categorization that shook medieval Europe's understanding of divine order. Marco Polo's travel journals threw fuel on the fire. He described encountering Cynocephali on remote islands near India, painting them not as mindless monsters but as sophisticated hunters who traded precious gems and wore clothing stitched from animal hides. Suddenly, the debate wasn't academic, it was urgent. If these dog-headed folk-built societies followed laws and bartered goods, how could they be mere animals? Some scholars argued they were descendants of Cain, cursed with bestial features for their sins. Others saw them as proof of God's boundless creativity, a reminder that his designs might stretch beyond human comprehension. The Cynocephali's legacy didn't fade with the Middle Ages. Listen closely to modern werewolf myths, and you'll hear echoes of those medieval fears, the terror of the civilized self unraveling into something primal. But there's a crucial difference. Where werewolves represent loss of control, the Cynocephali were always in command of their hybrid nature. They didn't transform under the full moon, they simply were. That's what made them so unsettling. They forced observers to confront an uncomfortable truth. The boundary between man and beast might be thinner than anyone dared admit. What's most revealing about these dog-headed warriors isn't their teeth or their tails, it's how they mirror the societies that imagined them. To medieval Europeans, they embodied the fear of the other, the anxiety that beyond Christendom lay people so alien they might not even qualify as human. Yet in their very strangeness, the Cynocephali also offered a perverse kind of hope. If God could create and love such beings, then perhaps no soul, no matter how foreign, was beyond redemption. In the end, their lasting power lies not in their snarls, but in the questions they snarled into history. Who gets to define humanity, and what happens when the definitions start to blur? The dragon coiled at the edge of the medieval map wasn't just a creature, it was a revolution waiting to happen. Unlike the fire-breathing, treasure-hoarding beasts of later tales, these early dragons slithered through the margins as sinuous serpents, their scales etched in ink that seemed to pulse with warning. They didn't guard gold, they guarded boundaries, marking the liminal spaces where civilization frayed into wilderness and faith into doubt. To the Christian cartographer's quill, every flick of a dragon's tail was a stroke of theology, this far and no farther. Consider the legend of St. George not as a fairy tale, but as geopolitical propaganda. When his lance pierced the dragon's hide, it wasn't merely a monster that fell, it was the specter of pagan resistance, the old gods writhing beneath the weight of the cross. Maps amplified this narrative, planting dragons along the frontiers of the known world like spiritual landmines. Venture east, they whispered, and you risk more than getting lost, you risk losing your soul. Yet the irony is delicious. While Europe's dragons snarled as symbols of evil, their eastern counterparts often shimmered with divine authority. Chinese emperors wrapped themselves in dragon motifs as emblems of celestial mandate, their long, limbless forms weaving through tapestries as benevolent rain-bringers. Persian dragons guarded sacred knowledge rather than threatening it. This cultural dissonance wasn't lost on medieval scholars. Some maps began to reflect this split personality, depicting dragons with two faces, one fanged and furious, the other almost serene. A quiet admission that even monsters could wear different masks depending on who was looking. Beneath the ink and allegory, though, lurked a kernel of real-world terror. When travelers described dragons in the Caucasus or the Himalayas, they might have been staring at the last echoes of dinosaurs, massive fossil bones weathering out of cliffs, their elongated vertebrae perfectly serpentine. Or perhaps they'd encountered Nile crocodiles, their armored backs breaching rivers like living relics of a prehistoric age. The dragon's genius was its adaptability. It could be Satan one moment, a misunderstood omen the next. What makes the medieval dragon endure isn't its fearsomeness, but its fluidity. It was the ultimate Rorschach test, revealing more about the beholder than the beast. To the devout, a call to holy war. To the curious, a challenge to look beyond dogma. And to the map makers, a masterstroke of psychological cartography, turning blank spaces into battlegrounds of the imagination. Even today, when we say, "Here be dragons," we're not just evoking monsters, we're confessing how little we truly know. The Manticore wasn't just a monster, it was a masterpiece of medieval propaganda, stitched together from the darkest fears of Christendom. Picture the scene: a creature with the golden mane of a lion, the venomous barb of a scorpion, and worst of all, the face of a man, twisted into something neither beast nor human but some unholy fusion of both. This wasn't just a predator, it was a perversion, a walking violation of nature's order, and when it hunted, it left no bones behind, only silence. That detail alone tells you everything. The Manticore didn't just kill, it erased. This nightmare had its roots in Persia, where it was known as the Martiak's War, or Man-Eater. But by the time it slunk onto European maps, it had become something far more potent, a symbol of the Islamic world's perceived threat. Think about the timing. The Crusades were raging, and every caravan from the east brought back not just spices and silks, but whispers of sultans with armies vast as deserts, of cities where churches had been turned to mosques. The Manticore became the perfect metaphor for that gnawing anxiety, a beast that consumed without remorse, leaving no trace of what it had once been. What's fascinating is how the Manticore's anatomy mirrored European biases. The lion's body, a nod to the wealth and power of Eastern empires, the scorpion's tail. The stealthy, insidious danger they represented. But it's the human face that chills the most because it forced medieval viewers to confront the idea that their enemies weren't mindless brutes, but cunning, even intelligent. That made the threat far more unsettling. Yet the Manticore wasn't just a political weapon. It also exposed the limits of medieval natural science. When travelers described tigers, creatures Europe had never seen, their striped pelts and terrifying roars were so alien that scribes mashed them together with local legends. The result, a hybrid that felt truer to the fears of the age than to any living creature. The Manticore thrived in that gap between knowledge and imagination, where the unknown became monstrous. And here's the twist: in Persian lore, the Manticore wasn't inherently evil. It was a rare, almost mystical part of the natural world. But on Christian maps, it morphed into a demon of the borders, a warning against venturing too far into lands where faith and faces might not look familiar. That duality is what makes it so enduring. The Manticore wasn't just a story, it was a Rorschach blot revealing the prejudices of those who drew it. Even today, when we talk about foreign threats, we're still wrestling with the same old monster, just in new skins. The unicorn wasn't just a creature of fable, it was medieval Europe's most sacred contradiction. On one hand, its horn, or alicorn, was believed to neutralize poison, purify rivers, and even heal the sick, making it a living emblem of Christ's redemptive power. Church mosaics and illuminated manuscripts teemed with unicorns resting their heads in the laps of virgins, a direct parallel to the Lamb of God. But peel back the layers, and this symbol of chastity hid a tantalizing tension. The very method of its capture, lured only by a pure maiden scent, whispered of something darker, a blend of devotion and desire that unsettled the clergy even as they embraced its imagery. Consider the hunt scenes woven into tapestries like the Lady and the Unicorn. Here, the beast's surrender to innocence wasn't just a parable, it was theater. The maiden's lap became an altar, the unicorn's submission a martyrdom, yet the subtext simmered. Why did purity require such intimacy to tame the untamable? The answer lies in the East, where medieval maps placed unicorns frolicking beyond the Indus River. These weren't just random doodles. By situating the unicorn in distant, unknowable lands, cartographers turned it into a test of faith. To believe in a creature so paradoxical, both fierce and gentle, divine and carnal, was to accept that the edges of the world held mysteries that defied logic. And then there's the horn itself. Merchants sold narwhal tusks as genuine alicorns for fortunes, claiming they could detect venom in a king's cup. Science scoffed, but the legend persisted because it worked, not magically but psychologically. A ruler sipping from a unicorn horn goblet didn't just drink water, he drank certainty, the illusion of control over a chaotic world. The unicorn's power wasn't in its existence, but in its ambiguity. It was both weapon and relic, a bridge between the known and the imagined. That's why the unicorn endures. It wasn't just a medieval symbol, it was a mirror. In its reflection, Europe saw its own conflicted soul, yearning for divine order yet fascinated by the wildness just beyond the map's edge. Even today, when we call something unicorn rare, we're not just speaking of scarcity. We're echoing an old, unresolved hunger for the pure, the unattainable, and the beautifully contradictory. The Yale wasn't just another curious creature sketched in the margins of medieval maps. It was a heraldic puzzle with horns that defied physics. Picture this, a goat-like beast, sleek and nimble, but with antlers that could swivel independently like twin swords in a duelist's hands. Unlike the rigid horns of ordinary animals, the Yales were weapons of adaptability, capable of turning to face threats from any direction. This wasn't just whimsy, it was symbolism in motion. To the knights and scholars who emblazoned it on coats of arms, the Yale embodied a perfect paradox, effortless grace paired with unyielding defense. Dig into old bestiaries and you'll find the Yale rubbing shoulders with biblical giants. Some scholars linked it to the mysterious Rem mentioned in the Book of Numbers, a creature so mighty it could only be harnessed by divine intervention. But here's where medieval imagination took flight. The Rem was likely a now extinct wild ox, its strength legendary. By the time the tale reached Europe, it had morphed into the Yale, a creature whose very anatomy whispered of God's ingenuity. Those swiveling horns, a masterstroke of celestial engineering, proof that the East held wonders beyond mortal comprehension. Yet the Yale's true power lay in its ambiguity. Unlike dragons or griffins, it wasn't a clear-cut symbol of good or evil. It could represent vigilance in one context, caprice in another. On the Bodleian Library's maps, it grazed near the Indus River, a quiet sentinel marking the boundary between the familiar and the fantastical. Its presence wasn't just decorative, it was a cultural shorthand. To European eyes, the Yale's very strangeness, those unnatural horns, that elusive nature became a mirror for the East itself, alluring, unpredictable, and forever just out of reach. What's most fascinating is how the Yale transcended its origins. By the Tudor era, it had leaped from maps to royal badges, becoming a favorite emblem of the Beaufort family. Margaret Beaufort, mother of Henry VII, adopted it as her personal symbol, twisting its meaning once again. Now it stood not just for Eastern mystery, but for maternal protection, a mother's love as flexible and unbreakable as those legendary horns. The Yale reminds us that medieval beasts were never static. They evolved, adapted, and occasionally swiveled their way straight into the heart of history. The Bonakin didn't just charge, it set the very air on fire. Imagine a bull with curled horns, built like a battering ram, but with a weapon so bizarre it blurred the line between terror and comedy. When cornered, this beast didn't gore its enemies. It spun around and sprayed them with flaming dung, a defensive tactic so absurd it made medieval scholars scratch their heads even as they inked it onto their maps. This wasn't just a monster, it was nature's punchline, a reminder that the East could be as ridiculous as it was dangerous. But there's more to the Bonakin's backstory than bathroom humor. Its origins trace back to Pliny the Elder, who described a beast in Asia Minor so timid its horns curled uselessly against its own skull, forcing it to rely on, well, alternative defenses. By the Middle Ages, that odd detail had ignited into something far more spectacular. The Bonakin became a walking contradiction, a creature too cowardly to fight head-on, yet capable of turning its retreat into a wildfire. Cartographers loved it. Here was a monster that didn't just guard the edges of the known world, it mocked anyone daring enough to trespass. What's revealing is how the Bonakin mirrored medieval attitudes toward the east. Its fiery excrement wasn't just a gag, it symbolized the unpredictable perils of foreign lands. One moment, you're trekking through uncharted forests. The next, you're dodging a storm of burning waste. The message was clear: venture beyond Christendom, and even the laws of nature might not hold. Yet the Bonakin's absurdity also served as a pressure valve. In an era where dragons and basilisks stoked genuine terror, here was a creature that let mapmakers and their audiences laugh at the unknown. Beneath the laughter, though, lurked a kernel of truth. Some historians suggest the Bonakin might have been inspired by misreported encounters with Gore, massive wild bulls whose defensive charges could trample hunters into the mud. Add a dash of campfire exaggeration, and suddenly, a panicked animal's flight becomes a spectacle of improvised pyrotechnics. The Bonakin's genius was its duality. It was both a cautionary tale and a cosmic joke, proof that even in their fears, medieval Europeans couldn't resist finding the humor. That's why this fiery bull endures. It wasn't just a warning or a whimsy, it was a testament to the human need to make sense of the unfamiliar, whether through awe or laughter. In a world where maps were equal parts geography and theology, the Bonakin stood as a cheeky middle finger to arrogance. After all, if even nature's rejects could rain chaos on the bold, what else might be waiting where the parchment frayed into blankness? Sometimes the scariest monsters aren't the ones that snarl, they're the ones that leave you choking on smoke and disbelief. The Caladrias wasn't just a bird, it was a feathered miracle, a living parable woven into the edges of medieval maps. Picture a creature so pure white it seemed carved from moonlight, perched at the bedside of the gravely ill. According to legend, this avian healer could gaze into a sick person's eyes and absorb their disease into its own body, then soar into the sun, burning away the affliction in a burst of divine fire. No talons, no fangs, just silent, selfless sacrifice. To Christian cartographers, the Caladrias wasn't merely an oddity. It was a winged promise that God's mercy stretched beyond Jerusalem into the farthest corners of their parchment world. What makes this creature extraordinary isn't just its healing power, but where it chose to dwell. Bescheries placed the Caladrias in the courts of Eastern kings, a deliberate nod to its role as a bridge between realms. In an era when disease was often seen as divine punishment, the idea that a bird could literally carry away sin, especially in pagan lands, was revolutionary. It whispered that grace wasn't confined by geography or creed. Even more striking, the Caladrias' selectivity. Legends claimed it would turn its head away from those it couldn't save, a haunting foreshadowing of mortality. This wasn't cruelty, it was truth-telling, a feathered prophet discerning who would live and who would meet their maker. The bird's symbolism runs deeper than feathers. Its whiteness mirrored the purity of Christ's robes, its flight toward the sun echoed the ascension. Some theologians even linked it to the story of the brazen serpent in the Book of Numbers, another divine remedy lifted high for all to see. But here's the twist: the Caladrias may have had humbler origins. Some scholars trace its lineage to real herons or egrets, birds whose habit of standing motionless by riverbanks might have inspired tales of solemn diagnosis. Others suggest it sprang from ancient Egyptian myths of the ibis, a bird sacred to Thoth, god of healing. Like so many medieval beasts, the Caladrias was a collage of faith, folklore, and fragmented natural history. Yet its legacy endures precisely because it embodies a paradox. In a world where the unknown was often feared, the Caladrias offered hope, proof that even the most distant lands might harbor sacred helpers. Its presence on maps wasn't just decoration, it was theology in ink. Every time a cartographer drew its slender form along the banks of the Ganges or the peaks of the Caucasus, they were making a quiet argument that the divine could wear feathers, that mercy flew on silent wings, and that no corner of creation, no matter how remote, was beyond redemption. The Catapelpers didn't just kill, it carried the weight of the world on its neck. Imagine a creature so burdened by its own lethal power that its head hung perpetually low, dragging its muzzle through the mud like a condemned prisoner. Part buffalo, part reptile, this wasn't a beast that lunged or roared. It was a slow, sorrowful executioner, its very posture a warning. One glance into its bloodshot eyes and your limbs would stiffen, your breath would falter. Death came not with a scream but with a sigh. What makes the Catapelpers so haunting isn't just its deadly gaze, but the symbolism coiled within its slumped form. Medieval scholars saw it as a walking cautionary tale, a reminder that some knowledge, some sights, were too terrible to bear. Its name, derived from Greek words meaning to look downward, whispered of a deeper truth. In a world where pride was the deadliest sin, here was a creature physically crushed by the consequences of its own nature. The message was clear: there are realms where even curiosity could be fatal. But where did such a legend begin? Follow the stench of marshes, the sluggish waters of the Nile Delta, where sickly wildebeest staggered under the weight of parasites or malnutrition. To a traveler from distant lands, these listless animals, heads drooping, movements sluggish, might seem cursed rather than ill. Add the toxic gases that sometimes seeped from swampy ground, capable of felling a grown man in moments, and suddenly the myth takes shape. The Catapelpers wasn't just a monster, it was a mosaic of misunderstood ecology, a patchwork of fear and faulty observation. Yet the beast's migration eastward is where the story twists. By the Middle Ages, maps began placing Catapelpers not just in Africa, but along the fringes of Asia, lurking in the same Inkai margins as Gog and Magog. No longer just a swamp dweller, it became a sentinel of the apocalypse, its downward gaze mirroring the bowed heads of the damned. Some bestiaries even claimed its breath could wilt entire fields, turning fertile land to wasteland, a clear metaphor for the spiritual desolation awaiting those who strayed from God's path. Here's the irony: the Catapelpers, for all its grotesquerie, might be one of medieval cartography's most human monsters. It embodied the exhaustion of existence, the weight of guilt, the paralysis of despair. Unlike dragons or griffins, it didn't revel in its power, it was shackled by it, and that's why it lingers in the imagination. The Catapelpers wasn't just a warning about the dangers out there. It was a mirror held up to the viewer, asking, what burdens do you carry, and what happens when you can no longer lift your head? By the time the Renaissance dawned, the Catapelpers had shed some of its terror, reduced to a curious footnote in natural histories. But its legacy endures in plain sight. Next time you see a buffalo grazing, head bowed to the earth, remember, the line between monster and mundane is thinner than parchment. Sometimes the most terrifying creatures aren't the ones that chase us, they're the ones too weary to look up. The Crocotta didn't just hunt, it spoke. Picture a creature with the sinewy frame of a wolf, the cunning eyes of a dog, and a voice stolen from human throats. This wasn't merely a predator, it was a performer, a mimic that weaponized language itself. According to medieval bestiaries, the Crocotta lurked along the shadowed roads of India, waiting to echo the cries of lost travelers or the sobs of grieving widows. Its trick wasn't brute force, it was intimacy turned lethal. In a world where every unfamiliar dialect could signal danger, the Crocotta became the ultimate embodiment of distrust. What chilled medieval audiences wasn't just the creature's deception, but what it revealed about their own fears. The East was already a labyrinth of unknown tongues, Persian traders, Mongol envoys, Hindu priests, all speaking in codes Europeans couldn't crack. The Crocotta magnified that anxiety into nightmare form. If even the howls of beasts could disguise human voices, how could anyone trust their ears? Some accounts claimed the creature could imitate specific individuals, calling a man's name in his mother's tone or whispering a lover's plea. This wasn't just mimicry, it was psychological warfare, exploiting the deepest human need to recognize and be recognized. Yet the Crocotta's origins might be more mundane than monstrous. Ancient naturalists like Pliny described the Crocotta as a hybrid born from wolves and dogs, a real-life phenomenon where interbreeding created animals with unnerving vocal flexibility. Hyenas, with their bone-chilling laughs and uncanny ability to mimic human sounds, likely fueled the legend further. But medieval mapmakers didn't care about zoological accuracy. To them, the Crocotta was a metaphor made flesh, the terror of the unfamiliar wearing the mask of the familiar. Its legacy lingers in surprising ways. Modern linguists study vocal deception in animals, parrots, lyrebirds, even dolphins, that replicate human speech. But the Crocotta's true power wasn't in its vocal cords, it was in its symbolism. In an age where crusaders marched eastward, armed with faith and swords, the creature whispered a subversive truth. Language could be as treacherous as any blade. The most dangerous monsters weren't always the ones that roared. Sometimes they were the ones that answered back in your own voice. The Enfield wasn't just stitched together from spare parts, it was a living emblem of medieval social climbing, a chimera crafted for one purpose, to legitimize power. Picture a beast with the sleek, cunning head of a fox, the razor-sharp talons of an eagle, and the muscular frame of a lion, all wrapped into one impossible package. This wasn't nature's design, it was the work of heralds and scribes, artisans of symbolism who understood that a well-placed monster could rewrite history. When the Enfield appeared on coats of arms or crept onto the edges of maps, it wasn't just decoration. It was propaganda in fur and feathers, a whispered claim. Our bloodline is so ancient, even the beasts bow to it. What's fascinating isn't just the Enfield's hybrid form, but where it chose to perch. Unlike dragons or griffins that guarded sacred treasures, this creature clung to the shields of upstart nobility, families like the O'Kellys of Ireland, who needed more than swords to prove their worth. In a world where lineage meant everything, a mythical ancestor could bridge the gap between ambition and legitimacy. The Enfield's fox-like face whispered of strategic wit, its lion's body roared of unassailable strength, and those eagle's claws. They were the unspoken threat. We grasp what we desire and we never let go. But the Enfield's genius lay in its duality. On maps, it often appeared near the fringes of known lands, a sly nod to the idea that some lineages, like some creatures, defied categorization. Was it real? Did it matter? For medieval audiences, the line between fact and fiction wasn't a wall. It was a curtain, easily drawn aside when the story demanded it. The Enfield thrived in that ambiguity, becoming a placeholder for the unprovable and the aspirational. Dig deeper, and you'll find a darker irony. The very families that adopted the Enfield were often those clawing their way up from obscurity, their actual pedigrees as patchwork as the beast they championed. In borrowing a monster's prestige, they revealed the flimsiness of feudal hierarchies where a well-designed myth could outweigh centuries of mundane reality. The Enfield wasn't just a symbol, it was a mirror reflecting the era's deepest insecurity. That power, like mythology, is just a story we agree to believe. And that's why it endures. Long after heraldry faded from fashion, the Enfield lingers in corners of pop culture, from fantasy novels to video games. Its legacy isn't in its claws or its mane, but in its lesson. That identity is always part invention, and every empire, real or imagined, needs its monsters. The Gorgon on a medieval map wasn't just a relic of Greek myth, it was a theological landmine, its serpentine locks hissing a warning to any pilgrim straying too far eastward. Unlike the classical Medusa, whose story centered on cursed beauty and Perseus's heroics, these map-bound Gorgons morphed into something darker, living embodiments of spiritual decay. Their stony gaze no longer merely turned flesh to rock. It symbolized the soul's paralysis, the moment faith crumbled into apostasy. When cartographers inked these creatures along the edges of Asia Minor or the Caucasus, they weren't decorating parchment, they were drawing battle lines between salvation and heresy. What's chilling is how seamlessly pagan terror fused with Christian dread. The Gorgon's face, once a symbol of Athena's wrath, now mirrored the devil's smirk. Medieval bestiaries described their hair as viperous knots, each strand a separate sin waiting to entangle the unwary. And those eyes, they became windows to a deeper horror, not just death, but eternal damnation. A traveler who met a Gorgon stare didn't just lose his life, he risked losing his place in God's grace, frozen in spiritual stasis like the idols forbidden by Scripture. The message was clear: venture beyond Christendom's light, and you might forget the face of your own Savior. Yet the Gorgon's migration eastward holds an ironic twist. Early accounts placed them in Libya, a land already exotic to Greek minds, but by the Middle Ages they'd slithered into the very regions where crusaders marched: Anatolia, Armenia, the Holy Land's periphery. This wasn't accidental. As European powers clashed with Islamic caliphates, the Gorgon became a coded critique. Its petrifying power mirrored the fear of conversion, of knights trading crosses for turbans. Some maps even showed Gorgons guarding the gates of mythical Eastern kingdoms, their presence screaming a silent question: how close can you get to the enemy before becoming one? But peel back the layers and you'll find a fragile core to this legend. The Gorgon's supposed victims, those frozen statues littering its lair, were likely inspired by real geological wonders. Cappadocia's wind-carved rock spires, eerily humanoid in silhouette, or the fossilized remains of ancient sea creatures embedded in cliffs, could easily become petrified armies in a traveler's panicked tale. The Gorgon thrived in that gap between observation and superstition, where every strange stone might be a sinner silenced by divine judgment. What lingers isn't just the Gorgon's terror, but its duality. For all its demonization, the creature also represented a perverse kind of purity. To be petrified was to be preserved, unchanged by time or temptation. In an era where the East lured with spices, silks, and new beliefs, the Gorgon stasis was both warning and warped ideal, a reminder that some souls would rather shatter than bend. Today, when we speak of stony hearts or frozen faith, we're still invoking the Gorgon's curse, the peril of staying rigid in a world that refuses to stand still. The hippogriff wasn't just another chimera, it was a paradox given wings. Born from the union of a griffin and a mare, this creature defied nature's laws twice over. Griffins, after all, were said to despise horses, their eternal rivals. Yet here was their offspring soaring above the contradictions, a living testament to the impossible. Medieval mapmakers tucked hippogriffs into the blank spaces of Asia Minor, not just as decoration, but as silent commentary on the East itself, a realm where sacred and profane, familiar and foreign, seemed to intertwine like the creature's own mismatched lineage. What's striking is how the hippogriff mirrored medieval Europe's deepest anxieties about cultural blending. The griffin, with its lion's body and eagle's head, was a pure symbol of Christian monarchy, earthly strength crowned with divine authority. The mare, by contrast, represented untamed instinct, the wildness of the steppes. Their union wasn't just biologically improbable, it was politically charged. To European eyes, the hippogriff became an allegory for the Mongol hordes or the Seljuk Turks' forces that seemed to merge martial discipline with chaotic ferocity. Its very existence whispered a troubling question: what happens when the lines between us and them aren't just crossed but erased? Yet the hippogriff also held a peculiar prestige. Unlike dragons or manticores, it wasn't inherently malevolent. In fact, its rarity made it a symbol of unattainable grace. Poets like Ludovico Ariosto would later immortalize it in Orlando Furioso, where the hippogriff carried heroes across skies and dreams, a bridge between the mortal and the sublime. But in medieval maps, it served a subtler role. Perched at the edge of known lands, it became a metaphor for aspiration, the longing for something just beyond reach, whether it was earthly paradise or divine favor. Beneath the legend, though, lies a curious footnote. Some historians trace the hippogriff's origins to real-world encounters with ostrich riders in the Mongol Empire. Imagine a European envoy witnessing a warrior atop a flightless bird, its long neck and powerful legs echoing both horse and eagle. Add the distortions of rumor, and suddenly, a diplomatic oddity becomes a mythical hybrid. The hippogriff's genius was its adaptability. It could embody terror or wonder depending on who told the tale. What endures isn't just the creature's majesty, but its message. In a world where borders were as much ideological as geographical, the hippogriff challenged the idea of purity. Its wings carried a radical notion that the most beautiful things might arise from the unlikeliest unions. Even today, when we speak of bridging divides, we're invoking the hippogriff's legacy not as a monster, but as a reminder that sometimes the impossible is just waiting for the right moment to take flight. The Lucrota didn't just mimic voices, it weaponized familiarity itself. Picture a creature with the graceful frame of a stag, the razor-sharp claws of a lion, and a grotesque, gaping mouth that stretched from ear to ear like a permanent, unhinged grin. This wasn't just a predator, it was a perversion of nature's design, a beast that could replicate the laughter of a child or the mournful wail of a lost traveler with chilling precision. Unlike the Crocotta's brute deception, the Lucrota's trickery was subtler, more insidious. It didn't just lure victims with sound, it shattered their trust in the very act of listening. Medieval bestiaries placed the Lucrota deep in the jungles of India, a deliberate choice that spoke volumes. To European ears, the East was already a cacophony of unfamiliar languages, a place where even human speech could feel alien. The Lucrota amplified that unease, turning the landscape itself into a lyre. Its voice wasn't just a tool, it was a metaphor for the disorientation of cultural collision. When every rustling leaf or distant echo might be a trick, how could a pilgrim or a conqueror know friend from foe? But here's the twist: the Lucrota's anatomy held clues to its symbolic power. That stag's body, a nod to purity and piety, traits long associated with deer in Christian iconography. The lion's claws, raw, unchecked violence. The creature was a walking paradox, a fusion of sacred and savage that mirrored medieval Europe's own conflicted view of the East. And that horrifying mouth, it wasn't just for show. Some texts claimed the Lucrota's jaw moved sideways like a serpent's, allowing it to swallow prey whole, a visceral image of the unknown consuming the unwary. The Lucrota's origins might lie in distorted accounts of hyenas, whose bone-crushing bites and eerie vocalizations could unsettle even seasoned hunters. Or perhaps it sprang from encounters with macaque monkeys, whose human-like cries echo unnervingly through Asian forests. But to mapmakers, the truth mattered less than the warning. By inking the Lucrota onto their parchment, They transformed a biological oddity into a moral lesson. Trust nothing in lands where even the beasts wear masks. What lingers isn't just the creature's grotesquerie, but its eerie relevance. In an age of deepfake voices and algorithmic deception, the Crocotta feels less like a relic and more like a prophecy. It reminds us that the most dangerous monsters aren't always the ones that roar sometimes. They're the ones that sound exactly like home. The Myrmecolian wasn't just a hybrid, it was a tragedy written in flesh and chitin. Picture this: the front half a mighty lion, muscles taut with pride, the rear a humble ant, legs skittering toward crumbs. But here's the cruel twist: its lion's throat couldn't stomach the grains its ant abdomen craved, while its ant jaws couldn't tear the meat its lion's heart demanded. This creature didn't just die, it withered from within, torn apart by its own contradictions. To medieval mapmakers inking its fragile form along the edges of Ethiopia or Arabia, the Myrmecolian wasn't fantasy, it was prophecy. A warning scribbled in the margins: some unions birth only starvation. What makes this creature so haunting isn't its grotesque form, but the precision of its metaphor. In an era when crusaders, merchants, and pilgrims were crossing into Islamic lands or Mongol territories, the Myrmecolian whispered a brutal question: what happens when two worlds collide but refuse to nourish each other? The lion's pride rejected the ant's humility. The ant's simplicity scorned the lion's majesty. Neither could bend, so both perished. This wasn't just biology gone wrong. It was a masterclass in cultural anxiety. Yet there's irony in its origins. The Myrmecolian likely sprang from a mistranslation. The Book of Job mentions the lion ant leish in Hebrew, a poetic term for predators that vanish like insects into the sand. But medieval scholars parsing texts through Greek and Latin took the metaphor literally. Suddenly, a linguistic flourish became a cautionary monster, its very existence a testament to how easily words like cultures can mutate in translation. But the Myrmecolian's true power lies in its duality. Unlike griffins or hippogriffs which blended natures seamlessly, this creature embodied dysfunction. Its presence on maps marked more than geographic boundaries. It signaled ideological fault lines. When European cartographers drew it near the Nile Delta or the Indus Valley, they weren't just filling space. They were sketching their deepest fears about trade routes and interfaith marriages, about spices diluting sacramental wine or Saracen swords reforged as crosses. The Myrmecolian was the ultimate what if. What if contact corrupts instead of enriches? Here's the twist: the creature's legacy isn't all despair. Modern biologists recognize something poignant in its plight. Real-world hybrids, ligers, mules, even lab-engineered chimeras often suffer from conflicting instincts or metabolic needs. The Myrmecolian, for all its absurdity, foreshadowed a genuine scientific dilemma. Nature, like culture, demands compromise. Those who can't adapt, whether cells or civilizations, risk becoming footnotes in someone else's bestiary. By the Renaissance, the Myrmecolian had faded from maps, its lesson either learned or ignored. But its ghost lingers wherever cultures clash without reconciling, in debates over immigration or globalization, in the tension between tradition and progress. The antlion's shadow still stirs. It reminds us that hybridity isn't enough. True survival requires something rarer: the courage to digest the unfamiliar, even when it sticks in the throat. The Ouroboros didn't just slither onto medieval maps, it swallowed the very concept of time whole. Unlike dragons or griffins, this serpent wasn't a creature to fear or fight. It was a riddle coiled in plain sight, its tail clamped between its teeth like a key turning in a lock. Cartographers tucked it along the edges of their parchment, not as a warning but as a whisper: beyond here, the rules change. In a Christian world view where history marched straight from Eden to Apocalypse, the Ouroboros dared to suggest something radical, that time might not be an arrow but a circle. And the East, that was where the loop began anew. What's mesmerizing about this symbol isn't just its age traced back to ancient Egypt and Gnostic texts, but how medieval Europe repurposed it. The serpent's endless feast mirrored the cyclical rhythms of Eastern philosophies, Hindu concepts of cosmic cycles, Buddhist wheel of rebirth, even Persian myths of eternal return. By placing it at the map's fringe, scholars acknowledged a truth both thrilling and terrifying. Other civilizations measured time differently. To pilgrims and crusaders, that undulating ring of scales wasn't just art, it was a cognitive fork in the road. Follow the straight path to Jerusalem, or venture eastward where history spiraled like smoke from a temple censer, yet the Ouroboros held a darker duality. In alchemical manuscripts, it symbolized purification through self-destruction, the serpent consuming its past to be reborn. That same tension pulsed through its role on maps. The East wasn't just a place of alternate timekeeping. It was where empires rose and fell like tides, where Genghis Khan's hordes could vanish as suddenly as they appeared. The Ouroboros, in this light, became a tacit admission. Christendom's linear triumph wasn't guaranteed. Civilizations, like serpents, could devour themselves. But here's the twist. The symbol's fluidity made it irresistible to medieval thinkers. Some saw it as proof of divine perfection, a circle being God's ideal shape, while others linked it to Judas's betrayal, the serpent forever gnawing its own guilt. Its looped body even echoed medieval zodiac wheels, blending astrology and geography into one cosmic dance. The Ouroboros didn't just frame the East, it reframed how Europe saw itself, not as history's endpoint, but as one stitch in an infinite tapestry. Today, we spot its legacy in pop culture's time loops and recycling symbols, but the medieval mapmakers understood something deeper. The Ouroboros wasn't just about eternity. It was about humility. That tiny inked serpent biting its tail at the edge of the known world was the ultimate memento mori, a reminder that even the mightiest kingdoms are just meals waiting to be swallowed by time's endless hunger. The panther was no ordinary predator. It was a walking sacrament, its very breath a hymn. Medieval bestiaries described this creature as a paradox, a beast with the sleek, powerful body of a jungle cat, yet exhaling a fragrance so divine it lured all living things into its presence. Unlike the snarling beasts that populated the edges of maps, this panther didn't hunt with claws or fangs. It captivated with scent, its aroma thick as incense, sweet as honeyed wine. To weary travelers tracing their fingers along parchment borders, the panther's presence whispered a promise. Even in the uncharted East, grace could bloom in unexpected forms. What makes this creature extraordinary isn't just its gentleness, but its timing. The panther appeared on maps during the Crusades, an era when the East was painted as a realm of Saracen swords and heresy. Yet here was a beast that mirrored Christ's own magnetism, drawing multitudes not through force, but through irresistible love. Its breath, they said, carried echoes of the resurrection. After feasting, the panther would retreat to its cave for 3 days, emerging with a roar that shook the earth, a blatant parallel to the Easter story. Cartographers weren't just doodling a pretty legend, they were smuggling theology into geography, turning terra incognita into a canvas for redemption. But the panther's perfume had practical roots. Ancient traders returning from India spoke of spices so potent they clung to the air for miles: cardamom, cinnamon, saffron, scents so alien to Europe they might as well have been magic. Combine that with sightings of real leopards, their musky odor softened by distance and imagination. and suddenly you have a creature whose very existence blurred the line between zoology and liturgy. The panther became a bridge, its sweetness tempering the East's reputation as a land of terrors. Yet there's a deeper irony. While the panther symbolized Christian unity, its legend likely sprang from Buddhist tales of the scented tiger, a compassionate beast that healed rather than harmed. Medieval mapmakers unknowingly had stumbled onto a shared archetype, proof that even in their fear of the foreign, they couldn't escape the universality of hope. The panther's lingering lesson that the unknown might not always bite. Sometimes it sings, and sometimes, if you're quiet enough to listen, it even smells like salvation. The phoenix didn't just rise from ashes, it carried the weight of eternity on its wings. This golden-feathered marvel, said to burst into flames only to emerge anew from its own pyre, wasn't just a curious footnote on medieval maps. It was a living parable, its life cycle mirroring the central promise of Christianity. That death was not an end but a doorway. Cartographers tucked its likeness near the edges of Arabia or India, not as a geographical marker but as a theological breadcrumb. By placing the phoenix in the east, they wove distant lands into the fabric of sacred history, suggesting that God's grand design stretched far beyond the borders of Christendom. Consider the audacity of that gesture. In an era when Jerusalem sat at the heart of most world maps, the phoenix's presence in the Orient whispered a radical idea that resurrection wasn't exclusive to the Holy Land. Its cyclical rebirth echoed Eastern philosophies of reincarnation and renewal, creating an unexpected bridge between Christian doctrine and the spiritual traditions of lands Europeans barely understood. This wasn't just cultural borrowing, it was cartographic alchemy, transforming foreign soil into fertile ground for prophecy. Yet the phoenix's flames held darker sparks too. Its self-immolation mirrored the martyrdom of saints, its revival a promise that persecution could not extinguish the faithful. When crusaders marched eastward, some carried banners embroidered with phoenix motifs, their own journey framed as a fiery trial before triumph. The bird's myth also tapped into medieval anxieties about the apocalypse, its cyclical nature a comfort that even cataclysm might birth something purer. But where did such a legend begin? Trace the phoenix's flight back to Herodotus, who described it as an Egyptian sun symbol, or to Chinese legends of the fenghuang, a bird of harmony. By the Middle Ages, these fragments had merged into a creature that transcended its origins, becoming a universal emblem of hope. Its feathers appeared in reliquaries, its story preached from pulpits alongside Lazarus's. The phoenix's genius was its adaptability. It could be Christ one moment, a symbol of imperial Rome's eternity the next. What lingers isn't just the bird's beauty, but its paradox. In a faith that preached linear salvation, the phoenix's endless cycle offered a counter-narrative. That redemption might be not a one-time event, but an eternal return. Its presence on maps wasn't just decoration. It was a dare to look beyond the edges of dogma and wonder. If ashes could give rise to wings, what else might the unknown hold? The salamander didn't just survive fire, it thrived in it. While medieval Europeans huddled around hearths, fearing the lick of flames, this unassuming lizard was said to dance through infernos unscathed, its skin glowing like embers. To the casual observer, it might seem like just another oddity scribbled in the margins of a map. But to alchemists and theologians, the salamander was a living paradox, proof that the East held secrets where nature itself bent to different rules. Its very existence whispered that fire wasn't just destruction. It could be a crucible, a purifying force that birthed rather than consumed. What made the salamander so captivating wasn't just its fiery habitat, but the layers of meaning coiled beneath its scales. Christian scholars saw it as a metaphor for faith tested by tribulation, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego walking unharmed through Nebuchadnezzar's furnace. Its presence on maps near the Caucasus or the Ganges wasn't arbitrary. It marked regions where the natural world seemed to defy logic, where volcanoes spewed rivers of flame and Yog is reportedly meditated unscathed on burning coals. The salamander became a cartographic wink. Here, even the elements obey a different scripture, yet the creature's legend burned brightest in alchemical circles. Its ability to withstand fire made it the ultimate symbol of transformation, a creature that could transmute destruction into renewal, much like the philosopher's stone turning base metals into gold. Some texts claimed its blood could render cloth incombustible, a notion that tantalized kings and popes alike. When Marco Polo described asbestos-laden fabrics in the East, woven from salamander wool, the line between myth and reality smudged like charcoal. Suddenly, a fable became a commodity, and the quest for the salamander's secrets fueled expeditions alongside those for spices and silks. But the salamander's story hides a quiet irony. Its myth likely sprang from real lizards darting into campfires to escape predators, only to scurry out unharmed as the wood crackled. To a medieval traveler, that fleeting glimpse, a creature vanishing into flames only to reappear, wasn't just biology. It was magic, and in that gap between observation and superstition, the salamander became more than an animal. It became a promise that there were places in the world where the impossible was mundane, where the rules of nature were written in a language Europe was only beginning to decipher. By the Renaissance, the salamander had slithered from maps into emblems, adorning the shields of kings like Francis I, who adopted it as a personal symbol of resilience. Its legacy, though, isn't in heraldry or alchemy. It's in the enduring human fascination with boundaries. The salamander didn't just inhabit fire, it redefined it, turning a force of terror into a realm of possibility. Even today, when we speak of trial by fire or rising from the ashes, we're invoking its ancient lesson that the East and the unknown it represented wasn't just a place of danger. It was a forge waiting to reshape those brave enough to step into its glow. The siren's song wasn't just a melody, it was a siren call to the medieval psyche, a harmony of desire and damnation that echoed across parchment seas. Unlike the mermaids of later folklore, these creatures were avian hybrids, their feathered wings and razor talons a stark contrast to their alluring human faces. When cartographers placed them along the coasts of the eastern Mediterranean or the Aegean, they weren't marking hazards of rock and reef. They were charting the geography of temptation itself, where the line between ecstasy and oblivion thinned to a thread. What's chilling about the siren's presence on maps isn't just her deadly allure, but the baggage she carried. Her eastern setting was no accident. To medieval clerics, the Orient was already a sensual minefield, a land of silk-clad seductresses and harems veiled in mystery. By grafting the siren onto these regions, mapmakers weaponized that bias, turning foreign shores into moral quicksand. The message was clear: venture too far east, and you might lose more than your way. You could lose your soul to pleasures that twisted virtue into vice. Yet the siren's roots run deeper than moral panic. Homer's original Odyssey described them as knowledge bringers, their songs promising secrets of the past and future. Their transformation into voluptuous menaces speaks volumes about medieval anxieties, not just about women's voices, but about the peril of curiosity itself. A sailor lured off course wasn't just succumbing to lust, he was abandoning his divine mission for forbidden wisdom. The siren became the ultimate cautionary tale. Some hungers, once awakened, could never be sated. But here's the twist: the siren's avian form might hold the key to her symbolism. Unlike fish-tailed mermaids, These winged creatures belonged to both air and earth, their very anatomy a rebellion against natural order. Their feathers evoked angels, yet their claws dripped with predation. This duality made them perfect scapegoats for a culture torn between piety and passion. Even their songs were a paradox, hymns of damnation so beautiful they could soften the resolve of saints. Beneath the myth, though, lies a flicker of historical truth. Mediterranean sailors often spoke of strange cries echoing from cliff sides, likely the haunting calls of sheer waters or storm petrels. Combine that with the wails of captive women kept in coastal towers by pirates, and suddenly the siren's legend takes shape. She wasn't just a monster, she was a mosaic of misunderstood sounds, a reminder that fear often fills in the blanks when knowledge runs out. The siren's legacy lingers not in her claws or her song, but in her uncomfortable resonance. She forced medieval Europe to confront its own contradictions, the way it both demonized and fetishized the East, the way it preached chastity yet whispered of forbidden delights. Even today, when we speak of siren calls or falling into temptation, we're invoking her ancient power, the terror of realizing that the most dangerous monsters aren't the ones that chase us, but the ones we're all too willing to follow. The Tarandras wasn't just a shape-shifter, it was a walking riddle, a creature that wore the landscape like a cloak. Picture a reindeer, antlers branching like bare winter trees, its fur rippling through shades of mossy green, slate gray, and even the deep russet of autumn leaves. Unlike the static beasts of European forests, this chameleon of the north embodied the medieval fear that the East was a realm of unsettling flux, where the very ground beneath your feet might shift its nature without warning. What terrified travelers wasn't just the Tarandras's ability to blend in, it was what that skill implied about the lands it inhabited. If even the animals refused to stay fixed in form, how could a pilgrim trust the rocks, the rivers, or the people he met? The creature's mutability tapped into a deeper anxiety, that venturing east meant surrendering to a world without stable truths. This wasn't mere camouflage, it was existential vertigo dressed in fur. Yet the Tarandras also held a peculiar allure. Its shifting hues mirrored the prized silks and dyes flowing into Europe from the Orient fabrics that seemed to change color with the light, their patterns alive in ways wool and linen could never replicate. In an age where identity was tied to heraldry and unchanging symbols, the Tarandras whispered of a different logic, that survival might lie not in rigidity, but in fluidity. The beast's origins likely sprang from garbled accounts of caribou herds, their coats transitioning seasonally from summer brown to winter white. But by the time these tales reached illuminated manuscripts, the Tarandras had become something far stranger, a living metaphor for cultural unease. When Marco Polo described the chameleon wolves of Tartary, their pelts shifting with the terrain, he wasn't just reporting fauna, he was confirming Europe's deepest suspicions. The East didn't play by nature's rules. Here's the twist: the Tarandras's legend reveals more about the mapmakers than the mapped. Its color-changing skin echoed medieval fears of Eastern deception. The silk merchant who switched gems for glass, the guide who led crusaders into ambush. But it also hinted at a grudging admiration. In a world where faith demanded absolute certainties, the Tarandras dared to suggest that adaptation wasn't weakness, it was wisdom. By the Renaissance, the creature had faded from maps, replaced by more scientific beasts. Yet its ghost lingers in our modern obsession with adaptability, in the way we praise those who blend in across cultures. The Tarandras wasn't just a warning about the East's strangeness. It was an early, uneasy nod to the idea that survival might belong not to the strongest, but to those willing to become strangers to themselves. The werewolf didn't just howl at the moon, it howled across borders, slipping between identities as easily as it slipped between skin and fur. While most associate lycanthropy with the dark forests of Germany or the villages of Transylvania, medieval mapmakers sometimes tucked these shape-shifters into the shadowed corners of the East, where the rules of nature and humanity seemed to unravel. This wasn't just cartographic whimsy, it was a visceral expression of Europe's deepest dread, that venturing too far into foreign lands might strip away more than just your way home. It might strip away your very soul. What's striking about the Eastern werewolf isn't its claws or its hunger, but what it symbolized. In Europe, lycanthropy was often tied to curses or divine punishment, a local affliction with a moral lesson. But place that same beast in the Caucasus or the steppes of Tartary, and suddenly it became something far more insidious, a metaphor for the corrupting influence of the unfamiliar. The fear wasn't just of a man turning wolf, but of a Christian turning pagan, a trader abandoning his faith for foreign gold. The werewolf's transformation mirrored the terror of cultural assimilation, the idea that exposure to Eastern customs, religions, or even languages might erase the boundary between us and them. This anxiety wasn't abstract. Crusader chronicles overflow with tales of knights gone native, adopting Saracen dress or Muslim customs after years abroad. To medieval clergy, such fluidity was as alarming as any physical metamorphosis. The werewolf on the map became a shorthand for this fear, a warning that the East wasn't just a place of material riches, but of spiritual contagion. Its very body, caught between forms, embodied the era's existential question: how much could you absorb from the other before you became the other yourself? Yet the Eastern werewolf also carried a paradoxical prestige. Some accounts, like those of Marco Polo, described shape-shifting shamans in Mongol courts, their abilities revered rather than reviled. To steppe nomads, the line between human and animal was porous, a source of power rather than shame. This divergence reveals the heart of the legend. The werewolf wasn't inherently monstrous. It was monstrous only when viewed through a lens of rigid European orthodoxy. Place it back in its original context, and suddenly, the beast wasn't a symbol of corruption, but of transcendence. Beneath the growls and snarls, though, lies a quieter truth. The werewolf's Eastern incarnation may have sprung from real encounters with cultures that celebrated fluid identities. Sufi mystics whirling in ecstatic trances, Hindu ascetics smeared with ashes like living ghosts, even the masked rituals of Siberian tribes, all could appear as shape-shifting to uninitiated eyes. The werewolf, in this light, wasn't just a projection of fear. It was a fractured reflection of traditions Europe couldn't or wouldn't understand. By the Renaissance, the Eastern werewolf had largely slunk back into European forests, its migration forgotten. But its legacy lingers wherever societies grapple with the tension between purity and hybridity. The creature's real power wasn't in its teeth, but in its duality. A reminder that the most terrifying borders aren't the ones drawn on maps, but the ones we carry within. The Ziphius didn't just lurk beneath the waves. It haunted the medieval imagination like a fever dream stitched from the ocean's darkest whispers. Picture a beast with the hulking body of a whale, but the hooked beak and glowing eyes of an owl, its wings replaced by monstrous flippers that could capsize ships with a single swipe. This wasn't just another sea monster, it was an abomination of air and water, a creature that defied the very boundaries of nature. Sailors whispered that its beak could splinter oak planks like kindling, while its eerie, unblinking gaze, borrowed from the night's most ominous bird, could paralyze a man with dread before dragging him into the abyss. What makes the Ziphius so unsettling isn't just its hybrid form, but where it chose to roam. Medieval maps clustered this horror along the eastern edges of the Mediterranean and the Arabian Sea, regions where European sailors felt most vulnerable. These weren't just waters teeming with unfamiliar currents and storms. They were gateways to lands shrouded in mystery, where Islam's ascendancy and the Silk Road's riches stoked both desire and distrust. The Ziphius became a physical manifestation of that tension, a reminder that the East's treasures came with teeth, yet beneath the terror lies a fascinating irony. The Ziphius's legend likely sprang from real encounters with nature's giants. Cuvier's beaked whales, which dive deeper than nearly any mammal, might surface abruptly near ships, their strange, bulbous heads and elongated beaks warped into something avian by terrified witnesses. Or consider the colossal squid, its tentacles coiled like serpents, its eyes the largest in the animal kingdom reflecting lantern light like an owl's in the dark. The ocean has always been the world's last great wilderness, and in an age without sonar or submarines, every splash could birth a monster. The Ziphius also served a darker purpose. It transformed fear into folklore. When a ship vanished without trace, whether from rogue waves, piracy, or navigational errors, blaming a winged leviathan was easier than admitting the sea's indifference. The creature's owl-like traits were especially telling. In medieval Europe, owls symbolized ill omens and hidden knowledge, their nocturnal habits linking them to heresy and the occult. By grafting these features onto a maritime terror, the Ziphius became more than a predator. It was a floating omen, a feathered warning that the East's waters held secrets too dangerous to uncover. But here's the twist: the Ziphius wasn't always a villain. In some Arabic and Persian accounts, similar creatures were revered as guardians of sacred depths, their hybrid forms reflecting the divine unity of earth and sea. This cultural dissonance reveals the Ziphius's true power. It wasn't just a monster, but a mirror. To Europeans, it embodied the peril of venturing too far from God's ordained waters. To Eastern sailors, it might signify the majesty of the unknown. The same beast, the same waves, but two entirely different stories. By the Renaissance, the Ziphius had faded from maps, replaced by more accurate renderings of whales and dolphins. Yet its legacy surges beneath modern myths, from the kraken's tentacles to the eerie, owl-eyed monsters of horror films. The Ziphius reminds us that the ocean's greatest terror isn't what hides in its depths, but what we project onto them. Every time we shudder at a shadow beneath the waves, we're still sailing on the edges of those medieval maps where the line between predator and parable dissolves like foam on the tide. The amphispina didn't just slither, it schemed. With a head at each end of its serpentine body, this creature was the ultimate paradox, a living Ouroboros that refused to choose a direction. Medieval mapmakers inked its coiled form along the borders of Armenia and Persia, not as a mere curiosity, but as a blistering indictment. In an era when the East was synonymous with shifting alliances and religious schisms, the amphispina became the perfect metaphor, a beast that could strike in two directions at once, its loyalty as fluid as its winding path. What made this two-headed horror so potent wasn't just its anatomy, but its symbolism. In Christian bestiaries, serpents already carried the stain of Eden's betrayal. But the amphispina, it doubled the treachery. Its dual faces mirrored the medieval obsession with doppelgangers and deceit. Think of Judas's kiss, or the Saracen envoy who swore peace while sharpening his blade. When placed on maps near the Silk Road's crossroads, where traders, spies, and mercenaries mingled, the creature whispered a warning: here, even the snakes wear masks. Yet the amphispina's origins reveal a deeper irony. Ancient Greek naturalists described it as a real, if exaggerated, desert dweller, likely inspired by legless lizards or worm lizards that move equally well forward and backward. By the Middle Ages, though, this biological quirk had morphed into something far darker. The amphispina became a political Rorschach test. To crusaders, its two heads represented the Fatimids and Seljuks, rival Muslim dynasties whose conflicts confused and terrified European invaders. To merchants, it embodied the capriciousness of Eastern markets, where deals could unravel faster than a serpent sheds its skin. The creature's duality wasn't just feared, it was weaponized. Some maps showed the amphispina coiled around the Tower of Babel, its twin heads echoing the chaos of fractured languages. Others placed it near the Caspian Sea, where Mongol hordes and Byzantine emissaries clashed in a tangle of broken treaties. Everywhere it appeared, the serpent served as a reminder. The East wasn't just a place of exotic spices and silks. It was a labyrinth of mirrors where friends and foes traded faces with the flick of a forked tongue. But here's the twist. The amphispina wasn't universally reviled. In Persian folklore, similar two-headed serpents symbolized vigilance, their extra eyes watching for danger from all sides. Armenian legends told of benevolent amphispinas that guarded mountain passes, their dual nature a gift rather than a curse. This cultural dissonance exposes the heart of the legend. The amphispina's monstrosity lay not in its form, but in the eye of the beholder. To Europeans steeped in binary morality, a creature that refused to pick a side was inherently suspect. Yet in lands where survival demanded adaptability, its flexibility seemed almost divine. By the Renaissance, the amphispina had shed some of its sinister sheen, reduced to a heraldic oddity on noble crests. But its legacy lingers wherever we distrust ambiguity. In the politician who courts both left and right, the ally who hedges their bets, the faith that bends but won't break. The amphispina's real poison wasn't in its venom. It was in the lesson it forced medieval Europe to swallow, that the world is full of creatures and people who refuse to fit neatly into boxes. And sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't the enemy you see coming. It's the one you never see leave. The aspidochelones wasn't just a monster. It was a floating betrayal, a leviathan so vast its scaly back breached the waves like an uncharted atoll. Picture weary sailors spotting what seemed like salvation after months adrift, a moss-dappled island ringed with sand, its shores inviting rest. But as they hammered tent stakes into the earth, built fires on its beach, the terrible truth would shudder beneath them. The ground would heave, the sea would boil, and in an instant the aspidochelone would plunge into the abyss, dragging the desperate and the doomed into crushing darkness. This wasn't just a predator, it was nature's cruelest practical joke, a reminder that in the East's uncharted waters, even solid ground could be a snare. What chills the bones about this creature isn't just its size, but its symbolism. In an age when maps were peppered with phantom islands and mirages, the aspidochelone embodied the terror of geographical deceit. Its name, stitched from Greek words meaning shield and turtle, hinted at its dual nature, armored like a fortress, deceptive as a siren's song. Medieval bestiaries linked it explicitly to Satan himself, citing Job's warning of the beast that makes the deep boil like a pot. The message was clear: the East's wonders were traps in disguise, its riches baubles on a bear trap. Venture too eagerly, and you might not drown in water, but in false promises. Yet the aspidochelone's legend likely sprang from real encounters with nature's giants. Ancient mariners might have glimpsed the broad, barnacled backs of surfacing whales or drifting icebergs sheathed in sediment, phenomena distorted by exhaustion and superstition. Even today, the ocean plays tricks. Volcanic islands emerge overnight, only to vanish beneath the waves. Floating mats of pumice mimic landmasses from a distance. The aspidochelones thrived in that gap between perception and reality, where every sailor's survival instinct to seek refuge could become his undoing. The creature's theological weight runs deeper still. Its habit of luring victims with apparent safety mirrored medieval fears of Eastern heresy's beliefs that seemed pious on the surface but dragged souls into spiritual ruin. Some maps depicted the beast with trees sprouting from its hide like the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, a direct jab at Islam's rising splendor. The parallel was deliberate. Just as the aspidochelones' beauty masked death, so too might the East's mosques and libraries conceal threats to Christendom. But here's the irony: the aspidochelone wasn't purely a Western nightmare. Arabic and Persian sailors told their own versions, like the Zaratan, a colossal turtle whose shell hosted entire ecosystems. In these tales, the creature wasn't malevolent but a test of wisdom. Only fools mistook it for land. The wise recognized it as a living lesson in humility. This cultural dissonance reveals the aspidochelone's true power. It wasn't just a monster, it was a Rorschach blot, reflecting each society's relationship with the unknown. To Europeans, it symbolized the East's treachery. To Eastern cultures, it celebrated nature's grandeur and human fallibility. The aspidochelone's legacy surfaces in unexpected places. Modern biologists study whale falls, where deceased leviathans sink to become temporary ecosystems, islands of life in the abyss, albeit without the murderous intent. And every time a hiker drowns in quicksand or a traveler follows a mirage, the old beast's lesson echoes. The world is full of illusions that demand more than trust. They demand discernment. The aspidochelone wasn't just warning sailors about the East. It was warning all of us about the cost of seeing only what we wish to see. The Manticore slunk into medieval manuscripts with a whisper, not a roar, its Persian roots clinging to its name like dried blood, while its cousin, the Manticore, brandished lion's fangs and scorpion's tail. This variant carried something subtler, a linguistic haunting. The Persian martia khvara, literally man-eater, wasn't just translated. It was twisted into a hiss that rolled off Latin scribes' tongues as manticore. That slight shift in spelling did nothing to soften its savagery. If anything, the new name made the terror stickier, a verbal burr that clung to the imagination long after the maps were rolled away. What's fascinating isn't just the monster's endurance, but how it persisted. Unlike dragons or griffins, whose symbolism evolved with the times, the manticore remained stubbornly literal in its menace. Bescheries described its triple rows of teeth like a shark spliced with a bear trap, and its preference for human flesh, often depicted mid-meal with limbs dangling from its maw. This wasn't allegory, it was appetite. While other beasts became moral lessons or heraldic decor, the manticore refused to be tamed. Its presence on maps wasn't a warning about pride or greed. It was a raw, screaming reminder. Some things out there just want to devour you. Yet the creature's staying power reveals a darker truth about medieval geopolitics. As crusades faltered and trade routes multiplied, Europe's fear of the East morphed from conquest to contamination. The manticore, with its venomous tail and human face, became the perfect metaphor for this anxiety, a monster that didn't just kill but mimicked. Its human-like features mirrored the fear of cultural assimilation, while its barbed tail stood in for the insidious, lingering threats of Eastern influence. Even its voice, said to be a grotesque blend of trumpet and serpent's hiss, embodied the dissonance between the familiar and the alien. Dig into its origins, though, and you'll find the real horror isn't in the myth, it's in the misunderstandings that birthed it. Persian and Indian art depicted Martiax, or as a guardian figure, its hybrid form symbolizing divine wrath against evil. But by the time these images reached Europe via Silk Road whispers, the context had been stripped away like meat from bone. What began as a protector became a predator, its nobility lost in translation. The Manticore's tale isn't just about a monster, it's about how fear distorts what it can't comprehend. By the Renaissance, the creature had slithered into heraldry and folklore, its name softening further into man-tiger or man-tiger, but the core dread remained. Unlike dragons, which could be noble or demonic depending on the story, the Manticore was consistency itself, always hungry, always other. Its legacy lingers today in our fascination with hybrid horrors, from werewolves to zombies, creatures that remind us the most terrifying monsters aren't the ones that lurk in shadows, but the ones that wear our faces while they feast. These creatures of ink and imagination were never just monsters. They were medieval Europe's collective subconscious spilled across parchment. Think of them as the original augmented reality, layers of meaning superimposed onto blank spaces where knowledge ran out. The Griffin's golden wings didn't just mark the location of Eastern treasures, they fluttered with the tension between spiritual purity and earthly greed. The siren's song wasn't merely a sailor's doom, it was the siren call of cultural contamination, the fear that exposure to the East might unravel Christian identity itself. Each beast was a Rorschach blot, revealing more about the mapmaker than the mapped. Consider how differently these creatures functioned compared to modern cartography. Today's maps use symbols for practical navigation, airports, rest stops, scenic viewpoints, but medieval map beasts were psychological waypoints. The dragon coiled at the edge of Asia wasn't directing traffic. It was asking, how much uncertainty can you tolerate before turning back? The headless Blemie weren't GPS markers, they were existential checkpoints, forcing viewers to confront the limits of what they considered human. This wasn't geography as we know it. It was cartography as therapy, a way to externalize internal fears about a world too vast to comprehend. The legacy of these creatures pulses through modern storytelling in surprising ways. Fantasy novels still populate their margins with chimeras, while sci-fi aliens often echo medieval, monstrous races with extra limbs or eyes. Even our political metaphors, dragons of corruption, siren songs of populism, a borrow from this bestiary. The real magic lies in how these symbols adapt. The Manticore, once a Crusade-era stand-in for Islamic armies, now prowls Harry Potter's universe as just another magical creature. Our monsters, like our anxieties, wear new skins for new eras, yet something profound was lost when maps became purely factual. Those swirling seas full of leviathans acknowledged the mystery inherent to exploration. A blank space marked, "Here be dragons," was in its way more honest than our satellite-imaged globe. It admitted that some things, whether distant lands or the human psyche, remain uncharted. The medieval mind understood that every map is part measurement, part confession. Every monster, a mirror held up to the cartographer's deepest hopes and dreads. So the next time you open Google Maps, spare a thought for those old parchment dreamscapes. Imagine what creatures we might draw at the edges of our knowledge, the AI overlords lurking in tech's uncharted realms, the climate leviathans rising from warming seas. We still invent monsters to embody what we don't understand. We've just swapped quills for pixels. The real question isn't which beast fascinates you most, but this: if you were to sketch the edges of your worldview, what would you draw staring back from the margins?